The Florida sun blazed down on Mar-a-Lago, making the golden trim on the building shine even brighter than usual. Inside the grand ballroom, staff members rushed around, arranging chairs in neat rows and checking microphones. The presidential seal had been placed carefully on the front of the podium, which stood empty waiting. 20 minutes till the press conference, a young aide called out, glancing at his watch nervously. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. It was his first big event since joining the team, and everything had to be perfect. Outside, reporters lined up at the security checkpoint. They fanned themselves with notebooks as they waited in the heat, making small talk about the latest political gossip. Secret Service agents with dark sunglasses and earpieces checked credentials one by one. "Press pass," said an agent to Reynolds, who held up her badge from the Progressive Voice. The agent studied it longer than he had for others, then reluctantly waved her through. Reynolds had been covering Trump for years. Her articles often questioned his policies and business dealings, earning her both praise from critics and scorn from supporters of the former president. Her notebook was already filled with questions about financial documents that had recently surfaced, documents she believed the public needed to know about. "Didn't think they'd let you in again," whispered a friendly reporter from another network as they walked toward the ballroom together. "Not after that article you wrote last week about the foreign business connections." Reynolds shrugged. "They have to let me in. Free press, remember?" But she clutched her press badge a little tighter, knowing how quickly things could change in Trump's world. Inside the ballroom, the air conditioning was on full blast, creating a stark contrast to the heat outside. Reporters found their assigned seats, setting up recording devices and testing their pens. Camera operators from major networks positioned themselves along the sides of the room, adjusting their equipment. Reynolds took a seat in the third row, not too close to the front but not hidden in the back either. She noticed her name card had been placed between two reporters from networks known to be friendly to Trump. Not a coincidence, she thought. The press secretary entered from a side door, scanning the room with sharp eyes. She spotted Reynolds and frowned slightly before walking over to confer with security personnel near the main entrance. They glanced in Reynolds' direction, then nodded at whatever instruction they'd been given. "Ladies and gentlemen, the president will be with you shortly," the press secretary announced, stepping up to the podium briefly. "Today's briefing will cover border security initiatives and economic policy. We'll have time for a few questions afterward." Reynolds opened her notebook to a fresh page. Border security and economics were important, sure, but she hadn't come for that. The folder sitting on her lap contained copies of bank statements showing unusual transfers between Trump's hotel companies and foreign entities during his previous time in office. 4 press conferences in a row, she'd tried to get him to address these documents. 4 times she'd been ignored. Not today, she thought. Today she would get an answer. The room quieted as the side door opened again. Trump's security detail entered first, positioning themselves around the room. Then Trump himself walked in, signature red tie standing out against his dark suit. He had that familiar, confident stride, nodding and pointing at reporters he recognized as friendly faces. As he reached the podium, camera shutters clicked frantically. Reynolds watched him carefully, noting how he adjusted the microphone, straightened his papers, and glanced around the room. His eyes passed over her without stopping. Did he know what she was going to ask? Was he already planning to avoid her? "Thank you all for coming," Trump began, his voice filling the room. "We have some very big announcements today, very big." Reynolds gripped her pen tighter. The real battle was about to begin, and this time she wasn't going to let him dodge the question that Americans deserved an answer to. 4 press conferences was enough. Today, one way or another, she would get the truth about those financial documents, even if it meant risking her White House press credentials. President Trump walked into the room with his usual confidence, adjusting his red tie before stepping up to the podium. The golden Mar-a-Lago ballroom sparkled under the chandelier lights. Camera flashes went off like tiny lightning bolts as he settled behind the microphone. "Thank you all for coming today," Trump began, his voice filling the packed room. "We have some very important things to talk about. Very important." He shuffled his papers and launched into his prepared speech about the border wall and his plans to boost American jobs. The reporters sat in neat rows, notebooks open and pens ready. Most nodded along as the president spoke, occasionally scribbling down notes. In the third row, though, Reynolds from the Progressive Voice tapped her pen impatiently against her notepad. She had dark circles under her eyes from staying up late, preparing tough questions about the financial documents her sources had told her about. When Trump finished his opening remarks, he looked out at the sea of hands that shot up. Let's take a few questions, he said, pointing to a man in the front row. Tom from American News Network, go ahead. Tom stood up, straightening his blue blazer. Mr. President, can you tell us more about the timeline for the infrastructure bill? Trump nodded, seeming pleased with the question. He talked for a while about roads and bridges, promising they would be the best roads and bridges you've ever seen. Reynolds raised her hand high, waving it slightly to catch Trump's attention. She had been trying to ask a question for weeks now, at every press conference, but somehow the president never called on her. Next question, Trump said, looking right past her to point at a blonde woman near the back. Lisa from Right Side News. Reynolds' frustration grew as she watched Lisa stand up with a friendly smile. Mr. President, how would you respond to critics who say your economic policies aren't working fast enough? Trump grinned. Great question. The economy is better than ever. The numbers don't lie, folks. As this pattern continued, with Trump calling on reporter after reporter, but skipping over Reynolds each time, she could feel her patience wearing thin. The story she was working on was important. The public deserved to know about these financial connections. Her boss had sent her specifically to get an answer, and she wasn't going back empty-handed again. When Trump pointed to a reporter sitting right next to her, Reynolds made her decision. As the other reporter began to speak, she stood up suddenly, causing heads to turn. Excuse me, she said loudly, cutting off the question that had just started. Mr. President, the American people have a right to know. The room fell silent. Trump looked annoyed at the interruption, his mouth tightening into a thin line. The reporter who had been called on looked up at Reynolds with surprise, then slowly sat back down. I wasn't calling on you, Trump said, his voice cold. I understand, sir, Reynolds replied, still standing, but I've been trying to ask this question for 3 press conferences now, and it's important. People in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some reporters looked embarrassed for her, while others seemed secretly glad someone was pushing back. Trump crossed his arms. There's a system here. We have rules. Yes, sir, but transparency is also a rule in democracy. Reynolds shut back, gripping her notebook tightly. And my question is about transparency. The press secretary, standing off to the side, took a step forward as if ready to intervene, but Trump held up his hand to stop her. Fine, he said, his eyes narrowing. Since you're so eager to disrupt everyone else, go ahead. What's this very important question that can't wait its turn? Reynolds took a deep breath. This was her chance. She could feel her heart pounding but kept her voice steady as she finally asked the question she'd been preparing for weeks. Little did she know this moment would soon spiral into a confrontation that would make headlines across the country and change her career forever. Reynolds stood firm, her shoulders back, as all eyes in the room turned to her. The air felt electric. Some reporters leaned forward in their chairs, sensing a moment worth capturing. Others looked down at their notepads, uncomfortable with the brewing tension. Mr. President, she began, her voice clearer now that the room had gone quiet. For months now, reports have been circulating about your business dealings overseas while you were in office the first time. There are documents that could show whether these foreign connections influence policy decisions. She paused briefly, glancing down at her notes. Will you finally release the financial records that would put these questions to rest once and for all? Trump's face changed almost instantly. The polite smile he had worn while answering friendly questions disappeared, replaced by a hard stare. Here we go again with the fake news, he said, shaking his head. Always the same garbage questions when we're trying to talk about things that actually matter to real Americans. He pointed around the room. Border security matters. Jobs matter. Not some made-up story you people keep pushing. Reynolds didn't sit down. Sir, with respect, this isn't made up. There are bank statements showing transfers from companies in. Next question. Trump interrupted, looking past her to another part of the room. But Reynolds wasn't finished. Mr. President, these are simply facts. The transfer records from Global Partners Limited to your hotel chain during the trade negotiations show. I said, next question. Trump's voice boomed through the speakers, making several people jump. The press secretary stepped forward to the side of the podium, leaning toward Trump to whisper something. He waved her off without taking his eyes off Reynolds. A reporter from a smaller outlet raised his hand tentatively, and Trump pointed to him with obvious relief. Yes, go ahead. The man barely got 3 words into his question about farming subsidies when Reynolds spoke up again. The American people deserve to know if their president had conflicts of interest, she said, raising her voice to be heard. These documents show money moving between your businesses and foreign governments while you were making decisions that affected those same countries. Trump's face was turning redder by the second. He gripped the sides of the podium so tightly his knuckles went white. You know what your problem is, he said, pointing directly at Reynolds. You don't care about the truth. You come in here with your mind already made up. I'm simply asking for transparency, Reynolds replied, holding up a folder she brought with her. I have copies of some of the transactions right here. All I'm asking is for you to explain. We're not doing this, Trump cut her off. I'm talking about keeping our country safe, and you're trying to rehash old news that's been debunked 100 times. A few reporters had pulled out their phones now, recording the exchange instead of just taking notes. The room felt split, some nodding along with Trump, others watching Reynolds with newfound respect. It hasn't been debunked, sir, she pressed on. In fact, new information came to light just last week about the payments from Eastern European investors too. Fake news. Trump's voice thundered through the room. This is exactly why people don't trust the media anymore. You push narratives instead of reporting facts. Reynolds took a step into the aisle. These are facts, sir. Bank records don't lie. If these documents are wrong, why not release your own records to disprove them? Some of the other reporters were exchanging glances now. A few looked like they wanted to ask follow-up questions, but weren't brave enough to join in. The press secretary approached the microphone again. We have time for just one more question, and then the president needs to. No, let's address this, Trump interrupted her. I want everyone to see what we're dealing with here. He pointed at Reynolds again. 4 questions about the border crisis. 0. Questions about American jobs. 0. But conspiracy theories about my businesses. That's all she cares about. Reynolds stood her ground, clutching her folder of documents. Mr. President, would you be willing to look at these records and explain the discrepancies? The entire room held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The tension had built to a breaking point, and everyone could sense that something was about to give. The tension in the room was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Trump turned away from Reynolds, trying to call on a friendly face from a right-leaning network. Let's get a question from someone who wants to talk about real issues, he said, pointing to a man in the back row. The reporter had barely stood up when Reynolds spoke again. Mr. President, you still haven't addressed the question about the financial documents, she said, her voice somehow both firm and controlled despite the pressure. This is the 4th press conference where this has come up. Trump's jaw tightened. He looked like a pot about to boil over. We're moving on, he insisted. The reporter he called on hesitated, caught in an awkward position. He slowly sat back down without asking his question, not wanting to get involved in the growing confrontation. Reynolds flipped through her notes. In January, you avoided this question. In February, your press secretary said you would address it soon. Last month, you walked out when it came up. The American people deserve consistency. A few reporters nodded. Others looked nervous, as if they were watching someone poke a bear. The camera operators adjusted their equipment, making sure to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. Listen, Trump said, leaning into the microphone. We've been transparent. More transparent than any administration in history. The most transparent ever. Then why not release the documents? Reynolds pressed. She held up her folder again. These records show money moving between your hotels and foreign officials during trade negotiations. If there's an innocent explanation, why not share it? The press secretary stepped forward, touching Trump's elbow gently as if to calm him. He shrugged her off. The look on his face made it clear he wasn't going to back down. You want to talk about consistency? Trump fired back. How about consistently negative coverage? How about consistently ignoring all the good we're doing? Reynolds didn't take the bait. This isn't about positive or negative, sir. It's about facts. Did you or did you not receive payments from foreign governments while making policy decisions affecting those same governments? The other journalists were now completely silent. Some were frantically typing on their phones, updating their editors. A young reporter who had been hoping to ask his first ever question at a presidential press conference looked like he might cry as his opportunity slipped away. Trump jabbed his finger in Reynolds' direction. You people never learn. Always digging for dirt instead of reporting the news. Financial transparency is news, Reynolds countered. She took another step forward. Mr. President, a simple yes or no. Will you release the full records that would clear this up? Trump's face had turned a shade of red that almost matched his tie. The veins in his neck were visible now. I've answered this 100 times. With respect, sir, you haven't answered it once, Reynolds said. A few gasps came from the press corps. Nobody talked to the president that way. The press secretary rushed to the podium now, leaning in to whisper urgently in Trump's ear. He listened for a moment, then nodded slightly. We're going to take one more question, the press secretary announced, trying to regain control. From the network in the far corner. But Reynolds wasn't done. The public has a right to know if their president has conflicts of interest. These aren't partisan questions. Enough! Trump suddenly shouted, his voice booming through the speakers so loudly that some people jumped in their seats. This is exactly what's wrong with the media today. The room went completely silent. Even the usual sound of camera shutters stopped. Trump stared directly at Reynolds, who stared right back, neither willing to be the first to look away. The tension was building toward something bigger. Everyone could feel it. The security personnel by the doors straightened up, suddenly alert. The press secretary looked like she wanted to disappear. And Reynolds, still standing, clutched a folder of documents like a shield, knowing she might have just crossed a line from which there was no return. The silence in the room lasted only seconds, but it felt like minutes. Trump's hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His eyes never left Reynolds, who remained standing, her notepad and folder clutched against her chest. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, now the only sound in the otherwise silent room. You know what? Trump finally said, his voice lower but somehow more intense than before. He leaned slightly into the microphone. This right here is exactly the problem with the mainstream media today. He gestured toward Reynolds with an open palm. The American people are worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about gas prices. They're worried about their safety. With each sentence, his voice grew louder. And what does the media focus on? The same tired questions, the same witch hunt, over and over. Reynolds opened her mouth to respond, but Trump raised his hand to stop her. No, you've had your say. Now I'm talking, he said. The flash of cameras intensified as photographers sensed a moment worth capturing. You don't want answers. You want a spectacle. You want a headline. A few heads nodded in the crowd, mostly reporters from networks friendly to Trump. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, unsure where this was heading. Sir, Reynolds tried again, these are legitimate questions about. Legitimate? Trump's eyebrows shot up. There's nothing legitimate about coming to every press conference with the same agenda, ignoring the real issues facing Americans. He looked around the room. How many of you have asked about the border crisis today? About inflation? About the crime in our cities? No hands went up. A reporter in the front row looked down at his shoes. Exactly, Trump continued. Because you're all following her lead. He pointed at Reynolds again, always looking for gotcha moments instead of reporting the truth. The press secretary whispered something in Trump's ear again, but he shook his head. No, the American people need to see this, he said, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. They need to understand what we're dealing with. Reynolds stood her ground. Mr. President, with respect, you're avoiding a simple question about financial transparency. This isn't about creating spectacle, it's about accountability. Trump's face darkened further. A vein pulsed visibly on his forehead. He leaned away from the podium, turning slightly to speak with a Secret Service agent standing nearby. The agent nodded and spoke quietly into his wrist microphone. Let me tell you something, Trump said, turning back to the room. When I was in business before politics, I dealt with tough people. Real tough negotiators. But they were honest about what they wanted. He pointed at Reynolds. They didn't hide behind fake concern for the public. They didn't pretend to be neutral when they had an agenda. Some reporters had begun typing frantically on their phones, live tweeting the escalating confrontation. Others looked toward the exits, as if wondering if they should leave before things got worse. For 4 years, Trump continued, his voice rising again, we've had to deal with this kind of disrespect. This kind of hostility. The American people are sick of it. I'm sick of it. Reynolds held up her folder again. These documents show specific transactions. We're done here. Trump cut her off. We're done with the games. We're done with the disrespect. He looked directly at her. Some people just don't understand how to behave, how to show basic respect for the office of the president. The press secretary stepped to the microphone. We'll take one last question from. But Trump gently moved her aside. No more questions today. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Reynolds. Someone needs to teach a lesson about respect and decorum in these briefings. The American people deserve better than this circus. The room fell silent again. Everyone could feel something was about to happen. The Secret Service agents by the door straightened up and began moving forward slightly. Reynolds glanced around, suddenly aware that the atmosphere had shifted from tense to something more ominous. Trump nodded almost imperceptibly to the Secret Service agents standing along the wall. 2 tall men in dark suits stepped forward, their earpieces gleaming under the bright lights. The movement was smooth but deliberate, and everyone in the room noticed it immediately. Reynolds saw them approaching but didn't back down. Instead, she quickly pulled out her phone and started recording. I'm simply asking questions the American people deserve answers to, she said, her voice slightly higher than before but still steady. This is a press conference, and I'm a credentialed reporter. Other journalists began to shift in their seats. A few pulled out their phones too, filming what was happening. A reporter from a major network stood up halfway, then seemed to think better of it and sat back down. Ma'am, the first Secret Service agent said quietly as he reached Reynolds' side. We need you to come with us, please. Reynolds held her ground. On what grounds am I being removed? I have press credentials and authorization to be here. She held up her White House press badge, still recording with her other hand. Trump watched from the podium, arms crossed over his chest. Sometimes you need to take out the trash to keep your house in order, he said into the microphone. The comment echoed through the room's speakers. Some people in the back of the room gasped. Others nodded in agreement. The room was suddenly divided between those who looked appalled and those who seemed pleased. Mr. President, called out an older reporter who had covered White Houses for decades, is this really necessary? Tough questions are part of. Tough questions are fine, Trump interrupted. Disrespect is not. Disruption is not. Pushing personal agendas is not. He pointed at Reynolds again. 4 press conferences in a row with the same question that's been answered 100 times already. That's not journalism. The second agent placed his hand gently but firmly on Reynolds' elbow. Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. Reynolds continued filming. The American people need to see this. This is what happens when you ask for basic transparency from this administration. Her voice was louder now, ensuring it would be caught on her recording. Financial records that every other president has released are being hidden, and now reporters are being physically removed for asking why. Some journalists were now standing, filming the scene from different angles. Others remained seated, looking uncomfortable or even frightened. The press secretary stood to the side of the podium, her face a carefully controlled mask that couldn't quite hide her distress. Keep filming, Reynolds called to her colleagues as the agents began to guide her toward the exit. This is what suppression of press freedom looks like. This is what consequences for bad behavior look like, Trump countered from the podium. His supporters in the room nodded in agreement. Maybe next time we'll have reporters who want to discuss issues that actually matter to real Americans. As Reynolds reached the door, still being guided by the agents, she turned to face the room one last time. The truth matters, financial transparency matters. Her voice echoed as the doors began to close behind her. The room erupted into chaos. Half the reporters were on their feet now, some calling out questions about press freedom, others trying to get Trump's attention for completely different topics. Camera operators swung their equipment between the podium and the door where Reynolds had just disappeared. Trump remained at the microphone, seemingly unbothered by the commotion. He raised his hands for quiet, and slowly the room settled down. "Now," he said, his voice calm as if nothing unusual had happened. "Who has a question about things that actually matter to the American people? Border security? Jobs? The economy?" A reporter from a friendly network raised his hand quickly. "Mr. President, can you tell us about your plan for creating more manufacturing jobs?" Trump smiled for the first time since the press conference began. "Now that's a real question," he said, while outside the doors, Reynolds was still arguing with security as they escorted her through the hallway and away from the press room, her press badge now confiscated, her phone still recording every moment of her removal. The news spread like wildfire. Within 30 minutes of Reynolds being escorted out of Mar-a-Lago, video clips were already flooding social media. Her phone recording, capturing every moment of her removal, had been uploaded directly to the Progressive Voices website and was racking up views by the thousands. Inside her car in the parking lot, Reynolds sat with her editor on speakerphone. Her hands were shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. "Are you okay?" her editor asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine," she replied, watching as other reporters began filing out of the building, many glancing her way. Some nodded in solidarity. Others avoided eye contact entirely. "They didn't hurt me, just took my credentials and escorted me out." "This is big," her editor said. "Really big. The clip is everywhere already." Reynolds sighed, suddenly feeling very tired. "I just wanted an answer about the financial documents. That's all." Meanwhile, inside the White House press office, phones were ringing nonstop. The press secretary huddled with her team, their faces grim as they watched the video spreading across news channels and social media platforms. "We need a statement," one young staffer said, pushing his glasses up nervously. "This looks bad." "The president stands by his decision," the press secretary replied, but even she looked uncertain. "We can't have reporters disrupting press conferences." Across town, at the headquarters of a conservative news network, producers were crafting a very different narrative. Presidente stand UP2 media HRASSNMENT flashed across their chirons as they played edited clips showing only Reynolds' interruptions, not her questions about financial transparency. "Finally, someone is holding these so-called journalists accountable," said a smiling commentator. "The American people are tired of gotcha questions and personal agendas." At the same time, on a liberal network, the full video played unedited. "Reporter rememuvdfr asking about financial transparency," their headline read. A panel of former White House correspondents debated the implications, their faces serious. "This sets a dangerous precedent," said one gray-haired veteran reporter. "Press conferences exist precisely so that tough questions can be asked, even uncomfortable ones." Online, the country seemed to split in two. Hashtags trending on both sides. Hashtag press freedom in danger competed with hashtag fake news gets what's coming. Comment sections became battlegrounds where no one changed their mind, and everyone shouted louder. Reynolds' phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Interview requests poured in from every major network. Her follower count jumped by thousands, then tens of thousands. Her mother called, worried after seeing her daughter on TV. Her old journalism professor texted, "Proud of you. This is what we trained for." By evening, Reynolds sat under bright studio lights at her network's headquarters. The makeup artist had covered the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of her exhausting day. She clutched a cup of coffee as the host introduced her. "So tell us what happened today," the host began, leaning forward with interest. Reynolds took a deep breath. "I asked a question about financial transparency that the president has avoided answering for months. Documents have surfaced showing concerning financial connections, and the American people deserve answers." Meanwhile, at Mar-a-Lago, Trump sat watching the coverage on multiple TVs, his face darkening as he flipped between channels. His social media director hovered nearby, phone in hand. "Should we post a response, sir?" he asked cautiously. Trump nodded, dictating as the man typed. Minutes later, his message appeared online. Today's incident shows exactly why Americans don't trust the media. Reynolds had an agenda, not questions. Press room is for real journalism, not harassment disguised as reporting. Within an hour, his post had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. His supporters rallied, calling Reynolds every name in the book. His critics pointed to the post as further evidence of attacking press freedom. The next morning, Americans woke up to newspapers with split headlines. Trump PAGCTS REPORTR AIM-MIDQUS TIONS of Financial TRNS PARN. So I read some. Proteus identity Rius Teorius or DL in Proteus room, declared others. Press freedom organizations issued statements of concern. Political analysts debated whether the incident would affect Trump's standing with voters, and the White House released new, stricter protocols for future press briefings, effectively limiting access for outlets deemed disruptive, a thinly veiled message to anyone who might consider following in Reynolds' footsteps.